In this lecture, we're going to learn about initializer lists with constructors. We already know that we can set up a class like cylinder and use a constructor like this. And when we set up this constructor, what we have been using is member-wise copy initialization. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have been implementing our constructor like this. We pass the parameters in here, and inside the body of the constructor, we do member-wise assignment. For example, we take the radius param and assign that to our member variable for base radius, and we take height param and we assign this to our height member variable. This is what we have been doing, and it works just fine. But in this lecture, we're going to see that we have another syntax which might be better to do the same thing. And it is using initializer lists like we see here. The syntax is you're going to specify your parameter list like you see here. This is the same thing we have been using before. But what you do after your parameter list, you put a colon like you see here. And then you say which one of your member variable you want to initialize with these parameters. So we want to initialize base radius with radius param. We specify that with this parenthesis here. We put a comma and we say that we want to initialize our height member variable with height param. And when we do this, we don't need to do any member-wise assignment in the body of the constructor. The object is going to be initialized when it is being created. In the next lecture, we're going to really see the difference between these two ways of constructing your objects, member-wise copy initialization and initializer list initialization. But in this lecture, I just want you to be familiar with the syntax for initializer lists initialization with your constructors. And this is the way to do this. Again, we have our parameter list, we put a column, and then we specify our initializations with the syntaxes here. We specify that we want the base radius to be initialized with radius param. We specify that we want height to be initialized with height param using this syntax here. And for the last one, you don't put anything, you just put the body of your constructor, and the compiler is going to take this and it is going to use this to initialize your member variables. Okay, initializer lists have a few benefits. One of the benefits is that they avoid unnecessary copies. You have seen that if we do member-wise copy initialization, we are using the assignment operator. And if, for example, you have member variables that are objects, that's going to cause copies. And suppose you have a member variable which is a string, and you are copying that many strings. This is really bad, and in many cases, it's going to lead to memory waste because you are copying a lot of things and you're going to waste a lot of CPU cycles. With initializer lists, your objects are initialized when they are created and you don't really have to do any copy after the object is created. But this is really not the topic of this lecture. We're going to see more about this later. For now, I just want you to know that initializer lists have a few benefits, but in some cases, they are the only way you have to initialize an object. And we will have a chance to see this later in the course when we have more tools to really set this up. For now, we're going to head over to Visual Studio Code and see how we can play with initializer lists. Okay, here we are in our working folder. The current project is initializer lists for constructors. We're going to grab our template files. We're going to put them in place. And we are going to open this in Visual Studio Code. But before we do, I think it is a good idea to grab our files and use them for the cylinder class. We're going to grab them from the last lecture. We can do that. If you don't have them, please check the resource section of this lecture. You're going to find the source code attached, and then you can grab this cylinder files and use them in your project. I am just going to put them in here because I don't want to type this. It's going to waste time. So let's open this in Visual Studio Code by dragging and dropping here. This is going to open our project. We're going to have the main file and we're going to have our cylinder files. We're going to have the header file and the CPP file. And we can close the left pane here and do whatever it is we want to do here. What we really want to see is how to use initializer lists and initialize our member variables in our constructors. For example, if we look at the second constructor here and at the implementation we have in the CPP file, we're going to see that we are doing member-wise copy initialization. And what we mean by that is that we are taking the parameters and copying them manually into our member variables. So this is what we have been doing all along. It is working, but now we want to see how we can use initializer lists to initialize our member variables, because initializer lists have a few benefits. We are going to comment out what we have so far, and we're going to see how we can use initializer lists. The syntax is going to be almost the same. We're going to say the name of the class. We're going to say which constructor we want to implement here. We're going to say double rad param, the same thing we had in the other constructor, and we're going to say double height param, but the similarities end here. After this point where we have our parameters n, we're going to go down and specify a column. You don't really have to go down, you can do this on one line, but splitting this in different lines is better. Let's do this on the same line just to show you that it is possible. So we're going to say, let's say double param here. So we're going to say that we want to initialize our base radius with our rad param, and we're going to put a comma, and we're going to say that we want to initialize our height with height param. I think we can say that. And you see that this is good syntax. It is accepted by the compiler. Now that we have this in, we can actually go to the next line and put in our body, and the compiler is going to take this. And with this in place, we can go in the main function, include our class. We're going to include cylinder, and we're going to take out what we don't need here. We're going to go in the main function, create our cylinder object. We're going to call this C1, and we're going to only specify one parameter. I think we can do that because our constructor has a default parameter for the second parameter here, so we can do this. And if we print the volume, or we can even print the member variables, let's say base rad, and we're going to print the base radius down. We're going to say get base radius, and we're going to call a function here. We're going to put in our parentheses. We're going to put out the height, and we're going to put out the volume. If we do this, we're going to see our information printed out on the console. We can bring up a terminal because we want to run this program, and then we're going to build with GCC like we have been doing all along. So you see that the build is actually good, and we are using our implementation with initializer lists here. Again, the syntax is to say a colon after your parameter list, then you say which one you want to initialize with which. For example, the base radius here is going to be initialized with rad param, and the height is going to be initialized with height param, and we specify our initializers in parentheses like this. This is the syntax, and it is going to work. So this is really long. Some people like to split this into different lines and put our initializers on a second line. Even if you want, if you have many member variables here, you can split this again on different lines, and this is going to work, and it is going to be much more readable. Again, if we build this, this is going to build just fine. We're going to run the test to build with GCC. You're going to see that it is going to build fine, and we're going to have our information here. So let's clear and run Rooster. We're going to see that the base radius is 5. It is what we specified here. If we go in our declaration for the constructor, we're going to see that the default parameter is 5, and we can prove this because the height is 5 here. And we have our volume. If you plug this in, you're going to see that you get this volume here, and it is using the formula we have in our volume function implementation here. This is really all I wanted you to see in this lecture. The syntax you can use to use initializer lists, and it is really cool. Your body is going to be empty because by the time your object is created, it's already going to be initialized. And this is the syntax I usually recommend to do your constructors if you can, because it has a few benefits, as we're going to see in the next few lectures. We are going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to try and compare initializer list initialization with member-wise copy initialization. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.